One small farm lot, just over an acre, sat surrounded by open fields that nobody seemed to care about. When 70-year-old Thomas Carter offered $9,000 for it, the developers laughed at him. They said the awkward corner would never matter and warned that he was wasting his retirement savings. Thomas quietly bought it anyway, and months later, bulldozers arrived for an expansion worth $40 million. Then the schedules collapsed because the only practical route into the development crossed one forgotten farm lot. It was the same acre everyone had mocked, but this time, nobody was laughing. Thomas Carter had spent nearly 50 years working land that never truly belonged to him. He leased fields, repaired fences, and raised cattle whenever the seasons cooperated. By the time he turned 70, his knees weren't as strong as they once were, but he still believed every acre deserved a closer look before someone dismissed it. His neighbors often joked that Thomas noticed things other people drove past. Most days, they were right. One cool October morning, Thomas was hauling feed to a nearby farm when he spotted a narrow gravel lane leading to an abandoned field. At the corner sat a small farm lot, just over an acre. It wasn't beautiful. The fence had collapsed years earlier. Tall weeds covered nearly everything. A rusted irrigation pipe stuck halfway out of the ground, and an aging oak tree leaned toward the roadside as though it had been waiting decades for someone to notice it. Most people saw an overgrown patch with no purpose. Thomas saw something different. Not value, but potential. He parked his truck and walked the property. The soil was dry but firm. The lot bordered a quiet county road on one side and larger farmland on the other. It wasn't large enough for serious farming, and it wasn't attractive enough for developers. At least that's what everyone seemed to believe. Curious, Thomas stopped by the county assessor's office that afternoon. The clerk searched the parcel records before pointing to the screen. The previous owner passed away years ago. Thomas asked, "No family?" The clerk replied, "None who kept the property." "So it's available?" It recently came back onto the market. The asking price surprised him, $9,000. Thomas didn't rush the decision. For 3 days, he drove past the lot on his way to work. Each time, he stopped for a few minutes, watching and thinking. On the fourth day, he called the listing agent. "I'll take it." The paperwork was signed before the end of the week. When the sale became public, word spread quickly through the small farming community. Most people couldn't understand why a retired farmer would spend nearly all his savings on a forgotten acre that produced nothing. Even a few developers working on nearby properties heard about it. One afternoon, Thomas stopped at a local diner for coffee. Two men wearing construction company jackets recognized his name. "You're the fellow who bought that little farm lot?" Thomas smiled. "I guess I am." One of them laughed. "You paid 9 grand for that?" "I did." The second man shook his head. "There's not enough room to farm it, and nobody's ever going to build anything there." Thomas stirred his coffee without looking bothered. "Maybe." The first man grinned. "Well, if that's what makes you happy." Thomas simply nodded. He had heard people underestimate land before. What he didn't know was that, within a few months, those same men would be standing outside his fence, hoping he hadn't changed his mind about keeping it. Life returned to normal after Thomas bought the little farm lot. At least, that's how it appeared. Every morning, he fed his cattle. Every afternoon, he repaired fences or helped neighboring farmers with whatever work needed another pair of hands. The forgotten acre remained exactly as he had found it, quiet, empty, and ignored. Whenever he had a free hour, Thomas drove over with a chainsaw or a pair of pruning shears. He wasn't trying to develop the property. He simply hated seeing good land disappear beneath weeds. As he cleared brush along the roadside, something unexpected caught his attention. Vehicles he had never seen before began appearing with surprising regularity. White pickup trucks carrying surveying equipment, black SUVs with company logos too small to read from a distance, and men wearing reflective safety vests walked along nearby fence lines, stopping every few hundred yards to study maps before moving on. None of them entered Thomas's property, but they all seemed interested in everything surrounding it. The pattern continued for several weeks. One afternoon, curiosity finally got the better of him. Instead of driving home, Thomas stopped at the county planning office. The receptionist directed him toward a public records room where zoning applications, traffic studies, and planning notices were available for anyone to review. A planning technician named Emily noticed him looking through the files. "Can I help you find something?" I'm just wondering what's happening west of County Road 12. Emily smiled. You're not the only one asking. She explained that several property owners had submitted applications involving future commercial expansion. Nothing had been officially approved. No construction permits had been issued, and no final development plans had been released. Everything you're seeing is still under review, she said. Thomas thanked her and continued reading. Over the next 2 hours, he noticed a curious pattern. Several farms surrounding his little lot had changed ownership during the previous 18 months. Some had been sold by longtime farming families. Others had been purchased through different investment companies. The names were unfamiliar, but the transactions had all happened within a relatively short period. Thomas wasn't sure whether they were connected. Maybe several investors simply liked the same area. Maybe it was nothing more than coincidence. Still, when he spread the public parcel maps across one of the tables, another detail quietly stood out. His 1-acre lot sat almost exactly between the county road and a large block of recently assembled farmland. There might have been another way into those fields. There probably was. Thomas folded the maps and returned them to the counter. As he walked toward the parking lot, he smiled to himself. I've been farming long enough to know one thing. People don't usually spend millions buying neighboring land without having a reason. He still didn't know what that reason was, but for the first time since buying the forgotten acre, Thomas began to suspect someone else might eventually need it just as much as he wanted to keep it. Over the next month, Thomas paid closer attention to the traffic around his little farm lot. Not the cars rushing down the county road, but the unfamiliar vehicles that seemed to appear almost every afternoon. Some belonged to survey companies. Others carried the names of engineering firms or environmental consultants. None of them stayed long. They would park along the shoulder, step out with maps or tablets, study the surrounding fields for a few minutes, and then leave without saying much. Thomas found it unusual. The activity wasn't centered on his property. It was happening all around it. One Saturday morning, he stopped by the county recorder's office. He wasn't looking for secrets. Everything he requested was part of the public record. The clerk handed him several parcel maps, along with the most recent ownership transfers. Thomas spread them across a large wooden table. One by one, he highlighted the farms that had changed hands. The names on the deeds were different: Prairie Ridge Investments, CR Agricultural Holdings, and North Valley Properties. On the surface, they appeared unrelated. But as he compared mailing addresses and registered agents, a pattern slowly emerged. Several companies shared the same business address in a neighboring city. Others were managed by the same law firm. Thomas wasn't sure what it meant. He simply marked each parcel with a pencil. By the time he finished, nearly every field surrounding his 1-acre lot had been purchased within the last 2 years. His property sat alone in the middle. It looked almost accidental, yet somehow it was the only piece that hadn't become part of the growing collection. A week later, Thomas was repairing a section of fence when a dark pickup pulled onto the gravel shoulder. A neatly dressed man stepped out and introduced himself. My name's Eric. Thomas shook his hand. What can I do for you? I represent a group that's been purchasing farmland in this area. Thomas smiled politely. I've noticed. Eric glanced toward the little farm lot. We understand you recently bought this parcel. I did. I was wondering whether you'd consider selling. Thomas rested both hands on the top rail of the fence. That's a quick turnaround. Eric laughed. Sometimes opportunities change. What kind of opportunity? I'm afraid I can't discuss our client's long-term plans. Thomas nodded. I figured. Eric reached into his briefcase and handed over a business card. If you ever decide to sell, give me a call. Thomas asked, no offer? Not today. The answer surprised Thomas. Most buyers eager to acquire land named a price immediately. Eric didn't. He simply tipped his hat, climbed back into his truck, and drove away. Thomas slipped the card into his shirt pocket. He wasn't interested in selling. Not yet. There was still one question he couldn't answer. If this little farm lot truly had no special value, why had someone taken the time to track down the man who owned it? He had a feeling he wouldn't have to wait long before finding out. Thomas didn't have to wait very long. 4 days after meeting Eric, another pickup turned into the gravel lane beside his farm lot. This one was newer and cleaner. The company logo on the door belonged to a regional development firm. A woman stepped out carrying a leather portfolio. Mr. Carter? That's me. My name is Rebecca Lawson. I appreciate you taking a few minutes to meet with me. Thomas nodded politely. What can I do for you? Rebecca glanced around the property before opening her folder. Our company has been purchasing several neighboring parcels. I've noticed. We're trying to consolidate the area. Thomas smiled. Consolidate it for what? I'm afraid I can't discuss future business plans. He had heard that answer before. Rebecca continued, We're interested in your property. Thomas looked across the acre. The weeds still swayed in the afternoon breeze. Nothing about the land had changed. What are you offering? Rebecca slid a single sheet of paper across the tailgate of Thomas's pickup. $20,000, more than double what he had paid only weeks earlier. Thomas didn't touch the paper. Instead, he asked a simple question. Why? Rebecca smiled professionally. It would make our property boundaries cleaner. Thomas looked down at the aerial map attached to the offer. Cleaner? Yes. He studied it for another moment. If it's only about making the map look nicer, why would your company pay more than twice what I paid? Rebecca didn't answer immediately. The parcel has some strategic value to our long-term planning. What kind of strategic value? I really can't go into that. Thomas folded the offer and handed it back. I appreciate the visit, but I'm not interested in selling. Rebecca didn't seem surprised. We expected you might say that. She placed her business card beside the offer. If you change your mind, please call me. Thomas slipped the card into his pocket. I'll think about it. As Rebecca climbed into her truck, she paused with the door still open. May I offer one piece of advice? Thomas nodded. If another company contacts you, don't make any quick decisions. Then she drove away. Thomas stood beside the fence, watching the dust settle behind her truck. That last sentence stayed with him. She hadn't warned him not to sell. She had warned him not to sell too quickly. There was a difference. That evening, Thomas spread every business card, parcel map, and ownership record across his kitchen table. One buyer, then another, both refusing to explain why they wanted one forgotten acre. He leaned back in his chair. The offers weren't becoming clearer. They were becoming stranger. Somehow, he had the feeling the next conversation would finally reveal just how important that little farm lot had become. Thomas declined the offer, then went back to his normal routine. He repaired a neighbor's fence, changed the oil in his old pickup, and spent a Saturday morning trimming dead branches from the oak tree standing near the corner of his little farm lot. If anyone expected him to become excited over a $20,000 offer, they didn't know Thomas Carter very well. Money had never been the reason he bought the land. He wanted to understand it first. Nearly 2 weeks passed before Rebecca called again. Mr. Carter? Speaking. I was wondering if we could meet one more time. Thomas hesitated for a moment. I suppose that depends. On what? Whether you've brought better answers. Rebecca laughed softly. I've brought something different. The following afternoon, they met inside a small conference room at the developer's temporary field office. Unlike the first meeting, Rebecca wasn't alone. A company attorney sat beside her. So did a land acquisition manager Thomas hadn't met before. After a few minutes of polite conversation, Rebecca slid another folder across the table. We've revised our offer. Thomas opened it. $45,000, exactly 5 times what he had paid only a few months earlier. He remained expressionless. The attorney smiled. We believe it's a very fair price. I'm sure you do. Instead of looking at the dollar amount again, Thomas turned to the second page, then the third, and then the fourth. The room became quiet. Finally, he looked up. This isn't just a purchase agreement. The attorney folded his hands. What makes you say that? Thomas tapped several highlighted paragraphs. You aren't only buying 1 acre. He pointed to the first clause. This gives your company permanent access across the property. He turned to another page. This allows underground utilities. Then another. This grants future maintenance access. Finally, he pointed to one more section. And this gives you additional rights if the project expands later. Rebecca watched him carefully. Those are fairly standard provisions. For what kind of project? I'm not at liberty to discuss that. Thomas closed the folder. I thought you only wanted to straighten a property line. No one answered. Silence settled over the room. Thomas smiled politely. I've farmed long enough to know something. The attorney raised an eyebrow. What's that? When someone keeps asking for more than they first mentioned, it's usually because they need more than they're willing to admit. Rebecca slowly gathered the paperwork. So, you're declining again? I'm saying I don't understand enough to make a permanent decision. She nodded. I respect that. As Thomas stood to leave, the land acquisition manager spoke for the first time. Mr. Carter, if you decide to wait, don't expect the situation to stay quiet forever. Thomas gave a small smile. I don't think it will. Driving home, he couldn't stop thinking about one sentence hidden deep inside the contract. Future expansion rights. Not future maintenance. Not future repairs. Future expansion. Someone wasn't simply trying to buy a forgotten farm lot anymore. They were trying to secure part of something much bigger. Thomas folded the agreement and placed it on the passenger seat. For the first time since buying the little acre, he realized the next people to visit his property probably wouldn't be lawyers. They would be surveyors. The surveyors arrived exactly 9 days later. Thomas was repairing a broken gate when he noticed 3 white pickup trucks pulling onto the county road. They carried bright orange safety flags, tripods, and GPS receivers. Everything looked official. He leaned against the fence and watched without saying a word. The crew spent nearly an hour measuring neighboring fields. They marked fence corners, recorded elevations, and compared digital maps against old boundary markers. Eventually, one surveyor walked toward Thomas. Morning. We'll need to verify a few measurements across your property. Thomas smiled politely. What kind of measurements? Boundary confirmation. For whom? The development project. Thomas nodded. Do you have written permission? The surveyor paused. We were told access had already been arranged. I'm afraid it hasn't. Thomas reached into his truck and unfolded a copy of his recorded property survey. This parcel belongs to me. If someone wants access, they'll need my permission. The surveyor wasn't argumentative. He simply radioed the crew chief. Within minutes, everyone gathered around a pickup, studying maps on a tablet. One engineer arrived shortly afterward, and more discussion followed. No one crossed the fence. No one placed a single survey stake inside Thomas's property. Almost an hour later, the equipment was packed away. Before leaving, the crew chief walked back toward Thomas. I appreciate your professionalism. Thomas nodded. I have nothing against your work. I just want everyone to respect the property line. The man smiled. I understand. As the trucks disappeared down the road, Thomas looked across the neighboring fields. Something had changed. Not the land, but the people. Professional survey crews rarely abandoned fieldwork halfway through the day. If they left, there was usually a reason. That evening, Thomas opened the county planning website. A newly released public filing had been added earlier that afternoon. Unlike the conceptual maps he had studied weeks before, this version contained far greater engineering detail. He enlarged the transportation drawings, then the grading plan, and finally the preliminary utility layout. His finger slowly traced a thick line extending from the county road toward the future expansion area. It crossed neighboring farmland, reached the edge of his property, and then continued directly through the middle of his 1-acre lot. Thomas leaned back in his chair. For weeks, he had wondered why developers suddenly wanted a forgotten piece of farmland. Now he finally understood. It wasn't because his land was larger, richer, or more beautiful than anyone else's. It was because the most practical route into the entire expansion happened to pass through the only acre they didn't own. For the first time since purchasing the property, Thomas realized the next move wouldn't belong to him. It would belong to the developers. Thomas expected another phone call. Instead, the days passed quietly. No new offers arrived. No letters appeared in his mailbox. No survey crews returned to his property. Yet construction around him continued almost without interruption. Every morning before sunrise, trucks rolled through the neighboring farmland. Concrete mixers came and went. Excavators reshaped fields that only months earlier had been planted with corn. Steel columns began rising above freshly poured foundations. From a distance, the project looked busy and successful. But one section never seemed to change, the planned entrance. Each afternoon, Thomas drove past it on his way home. Orange safety fencing still marked the route. Stacks of drainage pipes sat exactly where they had been unloaded days earlier. A bulldozer remained parked beside a temporary gravel pad. Nothing had moved. At first, Thomas assumed they were waiting for materials. Then another week passed, and the equipment was still there. One evening, he stopped at the same diner where construction crews often gathered after work. As he poured himself a cup of coffee, he overheard two supervisors talking nearby. Still waiting on management. I heard the entrance package hasn't been approved. So they're pushing crews deeper into the site until it gets sorted out. That was all. No one mentioned lawsuits. No one talked about his property. But Thomas had spent most of his life listening carefully to conversations that other people ignored. The next morning, he drove by the project again. This time, he noticed something different. Surveyors were working along neighboring fields once more. Engineers walked the proposed entrance carrying revised drawings. A drone made repeated passes over the corridor before disappearing toward the construction trailers. Late that afternoon, every one of them packed up and left. Still, no equipment crossed onto the entrance corridor. Several days later, Thomas stopped near the project fence while watching crews unload concrete barriers. A field superintendent standing nearby recognized him. "You own that little parcel by the county road, don't you?" Thomas nodded. "I do." The superintendent glanced toward the unfinished entrance before answering. "I can't discuss company business." "I understand. But I can tell you one thing." Thomas waited. "We've been instructed not to start entrance construction until the access issue is resolved." "Does that affect the schedule?" The superintendent gave a tired smile. "We've got plenty of work elsewhere." He pointed toward the warehouse foundations already taking shape. "So the project isn't stopping." Then he looked back toward the idle entrance. "But that section isn't moving anytime soon." Thomas thanked him and drove away. That evening, he stopped along the county road one last time. From where he stood, the contrast was impossible to miss. Inside the project, cranes swung steel into place. Concrete trucks lined up at newly poured foundations, and workers moved in every direction. At the entrance, there was nothing. The same machines, the same fencing, and the same untouched stretch of ground. Thomas didn't need anyone inside the executive offices to explain what had happened. He had watched the pattern unfold with his own eyes. The company had continued building everywhere it legally could, everywhere except the one place that depended on his land. For the first time since buying the forgotten acre, Thomas realized something important. The developers were no longer trying to decide whether they needed his property. They were trying to determine whether there was any practical way to move forward without it. 2 mornings later, Thomas received another phone call. The number was unfamiliar. "Mr. Carter, speaking." "This is Rebecca Lawson." Thomas recognized her voice immediately. "We've spoken before." "We have. This time, I'd like to invite you to our project office." Thomas looked through the kitchen window toward the little acre. "Is this another offer?" "It's a conversation." After a brief pause, he agreed. The following afternoon, Thomas drove to the temporary project office overlooking the construction site. The activity was impossible to miss. Concrete trucks moved steadily through completed sections. Steel crews worked high above fresh foundations. Forklifts carried pallets across newly graded roads. The project was clearly moving forward, except for one place. The entrance corridor remained untouched. Rebecca greeted him outside the office. "Thank you for coming." Inside the conference room sat two people Thomas hadn't met before: Karen Bennett, Director of Land Development, and Michael Harris, the company's outside legal counsel. After a few minutes of introductions, Karen spread a large aerial map across the table. She pointed toward Thomas's property. "As you already know, your parcel sits here." Thomas nodded. Karen traced a single highlighted corridor extending from the county road toward the development. "This is the planned primary entrance." Nothing more. She didn't point to utilities or mention drainage. She simply let the map speak for itself. Thomas studied it quietly. After a moment, he looked up. "So this entrance crosses my property?" Karen answered honestly, "Yes." Thomas looked back at the drawing. The highlighted strip appeared wider than a normal roadway. He said nothing. Instead, he continued studying the map. Karen noticed. "You have a question." "I do. This corridor seems larger than a road alone." For a brief moment, the room fell silent. Finally, Karen replied, "The corridor has to support the infrastructure required for the entrance." She offered no further explanation. Thomas didn't press. He already understood enough. Whatever was planned there involved considerably more than a strip of pavement. Karen slid a purchase agreement across the table. "We'd like to acquire your property." Thomas opened the folder. The offer was $180,000, nearly 20 times what he had paid. He turned the page, then another. The legal language immediately caught his attention. Permanent rights, construction access, utility easements, and future maintenance. He slowly closed the folder. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm not prepared to sell." Karen waited patiently. "May I ask why?" Thomas rested one hand on the contract. "Because this agreement isn't really about buying 1 acre." Michael, the attorney, leaned forward. "What makes you say that?" Thomas tapped several sections without reading them aloud. "If all you needed was the land, this document would be much shorter." Nobody interrupted him. Karen simply watched. Thomas continued, "This agreement gives your company rights that continue long after construction is finished." Karen nodded once. "Some long-term rights are necessary for a project of this size." "I understand." Thomas slid the agreement back across the table. "But I don't sign documents until I fully understand what I'm giving away." For several seconds, no one spoke. Finally, Karen broke the silence. "We respect that." She gathered the contract and stood. "I hope we'll have another opportunity to talk." "I think we will." As Thomas walked toward the parking lot, he paused beside the unfinished entrance. The machinery remained exactly where it had been days earlier, waiting. He looked back toward the conference room window. The company had finally admitted one thing: his property mattered. What they still hadn't admitted was exactly how much. Thomas didn't contact the developers for another week. He wasn't trying to gain leverage. He simply believed that decisions involving land should never be rushed. Each evening, he sat at his kitchen table with the proposed contract. He barely looked at the purchase price anymore. Instead, he studied every clause: permanent utility rights, construction access, future expansion, and maintenance corridors. The more he read, the clearer one fact became. The developers weren't just buying 1 acre. They wanted permanent control over everything that might ever pass through it: roads, water lines, power, fiber optic cables, future improvements, and even temporary access during later construction phases. Thomas closed the folder and quietly shook his head. The next morning, he called Karen. "I think it's time we talked again." That afternoon, they met at the project office. Karen smiled as she entered the conference room. "I was hoping you'd call. We both have a problem to solve." She placed an updated contract on the table. "We're prepared to improve the offer." Thomas didn't even open it. "I'd rather discuss a different idea." Karen looked surprised. "I'm listening." Thomas unfolded a county plat and laid it across the table. "You've spent weeks trying to buy my property." "That's correct. But ownership isn't what your project actually needs." One of the engineers leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Thomas pointed to the planned entrance. "You don't need my acre. You need the legal right to cross it." The room fell silent. The company attorney slowly removed his glasses. "A permanent access easement?" Thomas nodded. "And separate easements for utilities and drainage, limited only to what's necessary." Karen folded her arms. "If we agree to that, we still get the entrance, the utilities, and the drainage. The project moves forward, but you keep ownership." "Yes." One executive exchanged a quiet glance with the attorney. Karen studied Thomas for several moments. "Our investors usually expect us to purchase land outright." "I understand." "They'll ask why we didn't." Thomas smiled gently. "Because buying more than you actually need doesn't always make good business sense." No one spoke. Finally, the lead engineer broke the silence. "Technically, an easement would allow us to build everything required for the current project." The attorney nodded slowly. "Legally, that's true." Karen looked back at Thomas. "You've surprised us." "I wasn't trying to. You've had every opportunity to demand a much higher price." Thomas smiled. "I've never wanted to stop your project." He glanced toward the quiet entrance corridor outside the window. "I only wanted both of us to leave this table with exactly what we need." Karen closed the contract without another word. "I can't approve this today." "I wouldn't expect you to." She stood and offered her hand. But I think our next meeting will be a very different one. As Thomas drove home, the entrance to the $40 million expansion remained silent. For the first time, however, the future of the project no longer depended on whether he would sell his land. It depended on whether the developers were willing to change the way they negotiated. The developers didn't contact Thomas again for nearly 2 weeks. Construction continued across every completed section of the expansion. Concrete crews poured foundations. Steel frames climbed higher each day. Utility contractors worked throughout the interior of the site. Only one area remained untouched, the entrance corridor. Each afternoon, Thomas drove past it on his way home. The same equipment sat where it had been for days. Excavators, bulldozers, and stacks of drainage pipe. Nothing moved. Then late one Friday, the weather changed. Heavy clouds rolled across the valley. By midnight, rain hammered the county. Roadside ditches overflowed, low fields collected water, and by sunrise, much of the construction site was covered with standing runoff. Thomas drove over after breakfast. Engineers and inspectors were already walking the site. Some carried measuring rods. Others photographed washed-out slopes and temporary drainage channels. Karen spotted Thomas near the entrance. "Good morning. Looks like you had quite a night." She gave a tired smile. "We've had better mornings." Together, they walked toward the unfinished entrance. Freshly graded soil had washed downhill. Temporary erosion barriers had shifted. Water had gathered exactly where the proposed entrance would begin. Thomas stood quietly for a moment. He had seen this before. Not during construction, but years earlier. Whenever heavy rain hit the area, runoff always followed the same shallow depression that crossed the edge of his property before continuing toward the lower fields. He pointed toward it. After every big storm, the water naturally wants to go there. Karen looked in the direction he indicated. The lead engineer walked over. He studied the flooded ground before comparing it with the survey map in his hands. No one said much. The rain had revealed something worth investigating. Before leaving, the engineer thanked Thomas. "We're going to take another look at this." That was all. No promises. No redesign. Only another look. Nearly a week passed. Survey crews returned. This time they spent far longer along the entrance corridor than before. They checked elevations, measured drainage flow, and placed additional reference markers. Thomas watched from a distance, but never interrupted. 3 days later, Karen called. "Our engineering review is complete." Thomas met her at the project office the following afternoon. The lead engineer spread revised drawings across the table. "We didn't redesign the project because of the storm. The storm confirmed that one assumption in our original drainage model needed to be corrected." He traced a new alignment with his pencil. "Instead of forcing runoff across the entrance, we decided to work with the natural drainage pattern that already exists. The revision shifted portions of the entrance corridor slightly, reduced earth moving, improved long-term drainage, and lowered future maintenance requirements." Karen rolled up the plans. "You didn't solve our engineering problem." Thomas smiled. "I wouldn't know how." She smiled back. "But you reminded us that the land already knew where the water wanted to go." For the first time since the negotiations began, the discussion was no longer centered on a contract. It had become a conversation about understanding the land before trying to change it. Nearly 2 weeks passed before Karen called again. "Mr. Carter, speaking. I believe we're finally ready." Thomas smiled. "I was wondering when I'd hear from you." The meeting took place at the same temporary project office. This time, the atmosphere felt noticeably different. Nobody seemed interested in persuading him. The conference table held only a revised site plan, a boundary survey, and a much thinner legal folder. Karen welcomed him inside. "Since our last meeting, we've completed several internal reviews." She glanced toward the attorney. "Legal reviewed the easement proposal." The attorney nodded. "Our insurance carrier reviewed it as well." The lead engineer continued. "We also updated the final survey and drainage alignment." Karen added one final point. "And our investors approved moving forward under the revised structure." Thomas quietly listened. It was the first time he felt everyone in the room had already accepted one important fact. They were no longer trying to buy his property. They were trying to build a project around it. The lead engineer unfolded the final drawings. The entrance corridor remained, but it was noticeably narrower than before. Several temporary work areas had disappeared completely. So this is the final layout? It is. No future expansion area. Karen shook her head. If the project ever expands again, we'll negotiate separately. Thomas appreciated the answer. Nothing was being assumed anymore. The attorney handed him the revised agreement. This isn't a purchase contract. Thomas opened it carefully. The company requested 3 permanent easements, one for the entrance road, one for underground utilities, and one for drainage maintenance. Each easement included surveyed legal descriptions with fixed boundaries. Any future use outside those limits would require a completely new agreement. Thomas continued reading. Another section required the developer to restore any damaged fencing, drainage, or pasture caused during construction. Another required ongoing maintenance of every improvement built inside the easement area. If future repairs affected Thomas's remaining property, the company would restore it at its own expense. Thomas closed the folder for a moment. I have one request. Karen nodded. We're listening. I'd like every adjoining landowner to receive a copy of the final drainage plan before construction resumes. The engineer smiled. I was hoping you'd ask. Thomas looked surprised. The engineer continued. After the storm, we realized this project affects more than one property. Karen looked toward the attorney. Can we include that? He nodded. We already drafted the language. The revised page was placed in front of Thomas. He read it carefully. Satisfied, he signed. Karen signed immediately afterward. The attorney gathered the completed documents. The surveyor marked the final easement locations on the official plat. Only then did Karen stand and extend her hand. I think we've reached a fair agreement. Thomas shook it. So do I. As he prepared to leave, the lead engineer stopped him. May I ask you something? Thomas smiled. Of course. When you bought this little acre, did you ever imagine we'd end up here? Thomas laughed softly. Not once. Then why buy it? Thomas looked out the window toward the quiet entrance corridor. Because everyone kept telling me it wasn't worth anything. He smiled. But nobody could explain why they cared so much about who owned it. Karen looked toward the window as well. For the first time since the negotiations began, nobody in the room disagreed. Outside, the entrance remained silent for just one more day. The following morning, construction would begin again, this time under an agreement both sides had chosen rather than one side had demanded. Construction resumed the following Monday. Before sunrise, trucks lined up along the county road. Survey crews returned to the entrance corridor. Bulldozers moved into position. Concrete forms were delivered before noon. For the first time in more than a month, the entrance to the $40 million expansion was no longer sitting idle. Thomas watched from the fence for a few quiet minutes before climbing back into his pickup. He had no desire to stand in front of cameras. He had no interest in being called a hero. He had simply protected his property until both sides found an agreement that made sense. Months passed. The entrance road was completed exactly where the easement allowed. Water lines, electrical conduits, fiber optic cables, and the drainage system followed the surveyed corridor. Nothing extended beyond the agreed boundaries. Every inspection confirmed the same thing. The natural drainage continued working exactly as the engineers had predicted after revising the design. During the next rainy season, heavy storms swept across the county once again. The entrance remained open. The neighboring farm stayed dry. The revised drainage system performed exactly as intended. A year later, the expansion officially opened. New warehouses filled with tenants. Local suppliers gained new business. Hundreds of jobs were created for families across the county. The once forgotten farmland had become one of the busiest commercial areas in the region. One quiet afternoon, Thomas was repairing a fence when an unfamiliar pickup stopped beside the road. A man stepped out. Thomas recognized him immediately. He was one of the developers who had laughed in the diner months earlier. The man removed his cap before speaking. I've been meaning to come by. Thomas smiled. Looks like you finally found the place. The man laughed awkwardly. I guess I owe you an apology. For what? For thinking you wasted $9,000. Thomas leaned against the fence. A lot of people thought that. I was one of them. The developer looked toward the busy entrance road. I honestly believed that little acre would never matter. Thomas nodded. So did most people. The man hesitated. What made you buy it? Thomas looked across the land one last time. I didn't buy it because I knew it would become valuable. You didn't? No. He picked up a handful of soil and let it fall slowly through his fingers. I bought it because something didn't make sense. The land was supposedly worthless, but everyone who controlled the surrounding property seemed determined not to let it go. He smiled. When people's actions tell a different story from their words, I pay attention to the actions. The developer stood quietly for a moment before extending his hand. I'll remember that. Thomas shook it. As the sun settled behind the new warehouses, trucks continued flowing through the entrance that had once delayed an entire $40 million expansion. The little farm lot looked much the same as it always had. An old oak tree, a weathered fence, and a single acre of ordinary ground. Nothing about it suggested that it had once held up one of the largest construction projects the county had ever seen. Some people believe the value of land is measured by its size. Others measure it by its price. Thomas learned a different lesson. The true value of land is often revealed not when everyone wants to buy it, but when no one can move forward without it. If Thomas's story reminded you that value is often hidden in the details others ignore, share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever recognized an opportunity that everyone else dismissed? If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss more stories about patience, fairness, and unexpected value. Thank you for watching, and remember, the size of an opportunity does not determine its importance. Sometimes one ordinary acre can change everything when it stands in the place everyone else needs to cross.